So thank you. I'll hand it over to Ivy to introduce herself.
Thank you, Anne. I'm Ivy Anderson from the California Digital Library, which I think many of you know is a sort of a quasi-consortial unit that serves the University of California system. I've been at CDL for the last 15 years. I've been the director of collections for the CDL and also associate executive director, as Anne mentioned. And in that role, we've extensively used usage data for evaluation of e-resources, for collection analysis, decisions, negotiations. I had a similar position at Harvard before I came to CDL, where we also used usage data for cost distribution across the Harvard Library. So that's another use we've made of that. More recently at CDL, as some of you know, we've been very involved in open access transformation and negotiating transformative agreements for open access. And so we've used usage data in that context as well, slightly different ways. So I'll be happy to talk about all of that as the discussion continues.
Thank you, Ivy. Joanna?
Yeah. Thank you. My name's Joanna Ball, and I'm head of Roskilde University Library. Roskilde is one of 8 universities in Denmark, and it's a small research-intensive university about 20 miles outside of Copenhagen. Several of the university libraries in Denmark have a relationship with the Royal Danish Library, which is our national library. As part of my role there, I also lead on some open science initiatives across Roskilde, but also Copenhagen and Aarhus University libraries. I've also spent a number of years working within libraries in the UK, and I've actually both here in Denmark and in the UK have been heavily reliant on counter data. I have to say, I haven't been the person who's had the nuts and bolts knowledge of the data, but I've been the person who's been presented with it and used it to inform decision making around renewals, around cancellations, and also in terms of using it to demonstrate our value as a library. So, thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. And Amy?
Hi, I'm Amy DeBenley, and I'm the product manager for intelligence at JISC. And JISC is the national consortium for UK educational institutions, mainly higher education institutes, but increasingly further education institutions as well. I head a team of data managers and data who work with a number of data sets covering scholarly communications to drive and inform our negotiation work, but also to then also evaluate the existing agreements to ensure that they continue to meet the needs of our members. And previous to this role, I was working in a UK institution, so I did the hands-on data work using counter stats for both journals and books.
Thank you, Amy. And Jill?
Hi, I'm Jill Morris. I'm the Executive Director of the PALSI Consortium, which we have a new acronym. It stands for the Partnership for Academic Library Collaboration and Innovation. We are 71 academic and research libraries based mostly in Pennsylvania and surrounding states. And prior to working here as executive director, I was in a number of roles, both for PALSI and then previously for another statewide consortium in North Carolina. So for the past 13 years or so, I've worked in consortial negotiations of electronic resources, really looking at usage data from that perspective as somebody who has to evaluate what works well for a large and diverse group of institutions, and standardized data is a huge part of that. And so counter has been something important to me for a long time now. I'm also a project director for an open source project called CC+, and that is an IMLS funded project here in the United States. And it's an international collaborative effort, which is really exciting, to build out an open source software platform that allows us to harvest and store and then display as well usage data using counter compliant data And so for the past 3.5 years, we've been working on that, and I'll share probably more information about that shortly, and I'll drop a link into the chat in case anybody's interested in it. But we're just wrapping up sort of the second phase of this project, which is going to allow us to do an open source software release that will put it out there for the world on GitHub to use as needed. And it really was designed to scale to consortial needs for harvesting usage data. So really excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Jill. So our first topic here will be how libraries and consortia use counter data, and we would love to know what you all think. So here is a poll. I think if usually when I enter the chat, it's bad, but we can put the link in the chat. You can use the QR code here or go to slido.com and you enter the number. And you can go ahead and answer these. You can select more than one. Do you use counter data for acquisition decisions, renewal and cancellation decisions, informing negotiations, and demonstrating the value of the library to administrators?
Six one 694 861
A few more votes coming in. Maybe we'll call it there. So here we have, clearly they're all quite popular, but reneging renewal and cancellation decisions is that top of the list. That seems to be pretty common across our group here. Acquisition decisions, informing negotiations, and then demonstrating the value a little less. We know how important all of those things are. And so with that, I'm going to stop the share, check the chat real quick. Okay, and I think we'll open up for to our illustrious panelists. So a question for you all. How have you used usage statistics to inform acquisition, renewal, and cancellation decisions, and what approaches are most helpful? Maybe Joanna, we can start with you.
Yeah, of course. It's really interesting to see the results of the survey there, because I'm sure we all use counter data in terms of reviews of our current subscriptions and looking at them in terms of renewals. I think, cost per download or cost per use figures are really important in this regard, and certainly in terms of how we review our subscriptions on an annual basis within the Royal Library and in previous institutions, that figure is really important. Of course, it needs to be balanced in terms of the particular discipline that you're looking at. Different disciplines have different patterns of usage. So although a resource might have low usage, it could still be really important for a small group of researchers or students. But I do think that low usage is a really useful thing to take into a conversation with academic members of staff, because the response we quite often get is, yeah, but this resource is really, really important. But if you can demonstrate it's only been used a few times in the last year, that makes our case as librarians much stronger in terms of being able to argue the case for another resource that might be better value to the institution.
So both data-driven and one piece of the pie.
Yeah, it's a mixture, definitely.
Ivy, how about you?
I have to grab the unmute button. In our, we've used usage data in both renewal and cancellation decisions, and also in journal negotiations. So we've really tried to use it in a broad way. In our journal negotiations, and this is something that we did really before we were that involved in open access negotiations, in more traditional negotiations, we developed a very specific approach to journal evaluation that we called a value algorithm, which combined usage with a number of other factors. So we combined usage with citation data, with, we actually had three buckets of value that we identified as utility, value, and cost effectiveness. So we looked at usage and citation data as how were our authors citing works in these journals as the utility bucket. We looked at things like impact factor or SNP value for the value, implicit value of the journal. And we looked at then cost effectiveness, cost per use, and cost per impact or SNP value. And this is something that we did at the individual journal level and rolled up at the package level. And this allowed us to really look at our packages across the board to see which journal packages were giving us the most value or the least value in a sort of multivariate sense, and also to make individual judgments about individual journals in those packages. We were really very pleased with the results of that tool. It's complex to maintain, and so I would love to see a tool that actually could do that in a broader way, something like CC Plus that could store some of this data in a more collective way, but really allowed us to look very carefully at the value of each package and at the value of journals within packages. And we would use that both to make our own decisions about where to pitch our cancellation or retention decisions, but also in our negotiations with publishers, sometimes very effectively to show them where the value of their journals did not measure up to the value of other journals in similar disciplines based on those criteria. So that was a very valuable tool for us. With ebooks, we looked at, and this is something that we did before Counter 5 came along, where we had to aggregate data across at the chapter level. But we looked at trying to relate the number of uses per book to what it would cost to purchase those books, and how did that measure up against the cost of a package. You know, at what point was the package more cost effective than purchasing books that had certain benchmarked number of uses? And that was also a very effective tool for our campuses. So I'll stop there.
Amy?
Yeah, I think just to pick up on what Ivy said, we too use counter statistics to inform a lot of the negotiations. It's one of the value measures that we use to kind of look across a publisher's portfolio and identify the journals that are of interest to us. But we're also kind of increasingly using it in conjunction with other data sets. As Joanna mentioned, the cost per download metric is very useful when looking to evaluate and make sure that it's providing kind of value for money for our members. And we're also now looking at combining it with publication data. And if I can just share my screen, I'll just very quickly show you that one of the ideas that we're working with at the moment. So we're looking at setting the usage data against the publication data of our members to identify journals which are of real high value, both in the reading aspect and the publication aspect. So this would be this quadrant here. But then we can also identify two other quadrants that are perhaps of different interests to different members. So down here where we have in this, where's the mouse? Bottom right, it is the ones where you've got the high reading, but quite low publication. So that potentially is a read-only package for these journals, or then possibly these up here where there's quite a lot of publication but not as much reading, and then finally that lower left quadrant where they're perhaps not providing that value for our members. As I said, that's just kind of one of the value measures that we look at. Another thing to pick up on, I think what Joanna was talking about being conscious and aware of that kind of subject. The differences between the disciplines is we've played about a bit with the download per article. So where you get perhaps a discipline such as a humanities where they don't publish as many articles, so they might perhaps not generate as much usage. We've looked at that against perhaps more of the science subjects where they publish a lot more, so perhaps attract a lot more to kind of, I suppose, ease out that bias really and that skew.
So that makes a lot of sense. Go ahead, Jill.
I was just going to tag on and say we use many of the same calculations that others have mentioned, and there was a question in the chat too about using those data points for actually shaping the models that you acquire content with, and we certainly have done that here as well, where we've looked across our membership, taking many of those various factors into consideration that have already been mentioned, and then looking at what does that look like across many institutions, and where what models work best for a consortium or group of institutions based on that distribution of use. And many times I think you can work with a publisher to explain how that value is coming into consideration at all of those institutions. And oftentimes, many of the publishers we work with are really open to considering new models or new packages, even new offerings based on where they're seeing the value actually being obtained by those institutions. So it certainly opens up conversations when you're able to look at something and talk about it together. I think different institutions value different products differently, and when you're looking at a group of, and especially a diverse group of institutions, it's interesting to be creative with that data and try to figure out what ends up being a win-win, where you can increase access to materials because of how you've analyzed the usage that's happening.
Yeah, I would join that and say we've used some of this data, including graphics that show quite clearly where their value is not competitive with other publishers as part of our negotiation strategy with publishers, sometimes quite successfully. Of course, sometimes that depends on the publisher, how successful one is, but it's, I think, very, very useful to have data-driven conversations around value when it comes to pricing negotiations. It's hard to refute what the data shows.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in there on the discussion around value, because I think another use case within individual libraries is that we can use the data to identify resources that should be being used. We can't really understand why they're not being used, and then working with the academic staff, working perhaps with the publisher, and running a marketing campaign or kind of an education campaign to get the resource used more heavily. So it's not always about those hard and fast kind of cancellation renewal decisions, but it can also be something a little bit softer around our academic engagement.
That's a good point, and right, positive. It's not always about cutting and canceling, but encouraging use and looking for those that are kind of falling in the gaps. Resources can do that for different reasons. Discovery and access, and it's all related. So I think Athena's question was really interesting. Is anyone want to build off of this to look at using to negotiate different pricing model? Is that one that has come up for you all? Maybe Ivy?
We haven't used it in the context of pricing models per se. We've used it in the context of price negotiation to try and lower. Of course, we're representing a consortium as Jill is and others of you. So sometimes using data around lower use in certain campuses can would help us to negotiate a lower system-wide price for the system as a whole. Not so much the pricing model, but the actual price, right? Showing where a publisher did not benchmark well against other publishers.
And I think to keep, oh, go ahead, Amy.
No, I was just going to agree with Ivy that it's quite good to use it, that kind of cost per use for the benchmarking and look to see where specific journals are performing and groups of journals as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we've used it to sort of repackage offerings so that we were identifying, what's most critical for our institutions to receive. And in this past year in particular, that we really did need it in several cases where our institutions just simply couldn't do what the publishers needed from a price point standpoint. And so, we sort of worked with them to determine how do we find what is most valuable to these institutions, and then designed new offerings around that. So we didn't necessarily change the pricing model, but we actually changed what we were offering and the approach that we were taking, where before we were licensing everything, and then using counter data to help us find out what was most important and create alternatives.
And many of you do represent groups of libraries. Viva is in that same category. So we look at highest usage by any institution or by groups. There's that holistic aspect to it. How do you think that these kinds of issues are different when you are looking at groups of libraries as opposed to individual libraries?
One difference I would note is, and it's also being at a very high research intensive university system, often people talk about resources that aren't used or that are very little used. I would say there's very little at our university that is not used. The number of resources that show up as zero usage, I could probably count on one hand, or maybe fewer than one hand. So you're really trying to benchmark more aggregate data than the simple question of, oh, this is not being used. Everything is being used. It's really a question of then prioritizing when you have to, what is most used. So I would always, assert that there's value in most everything. It is being used by someone somewhere. Often uses that seem low are being used once a week by someone. That's not really unimportant, I think, but it's still an issue of relative value that one has to work with.
And I think it's perhaps, like Ivy said, about understanding that context as well within the usage. JISC represent a large variety of institutions, kind of ranging from very small research institutions to very big research intensive institutions to also kind of primarily teaching focused institutions. And we have a banding system for our members. So we will quite often kind of look at the usage across the different bands, because we want to make sure that any negotiation that we enter into is equally representing all of our members and meeting all of their needs.
And I think many times, building on what Amy just said, it's helpful to find peer groups of institutions to try and understand where value is for different types of institutions, and recognizing that, especially when you're licensing something across an entire group, that different institutions will value those resources and materials differently. So it's never a straight calculation, right? We always have to incorporate things we know about those institutions and figure out, why those differences are occurring. Sometimes it's related to mission. Sometimes it's related to availability of technology resources and staffing at an institution, knowledge of the staff in sharing those resources and materials with their patrons in some way. I know previously when I worked for a large statewide multi-type consortium where public libraries and academic libraries all had the same set of resources, it was just across the board in terms of how different resources were being used in those different scenarios. And we tried to come up with, we actually did a study that benchmarked different peer groups of institutions on particular electronic resources, taking their usage data and figuring out what various factors related to driving usage higher or lower. And in public libraries, a lot of times it was about capacity of the staff and customization of the public library website. And then in academic libraries, it was other things, factors like, do they have a proxy server in place? And this was 2014, so it was a number of years ago now. But factors like that really made it easy for people to access the materials. So there were different criteria that were in place for different types of libraries. And I think that's important to recognize as well, sort of our role in driving usage or not, and what those factors might look like.
You even already have a request for more details of your study, Joe, in the chat from Diane.
Oh, okay, I'll grab a link.
Well, another area of really high concern we know for libraries and publishers is open access. And Counter is not only about paywall or subscription content by any means, but that can be sometimes a misunderstanding. The code includes metrics for how libraries users access open content. And with release 5, there were really important steps to sort of make a more of a delineation there, a more separation between the two types of content. There's also currently a consultation that is out to publishers about how an optional way to report global usage and usage that's not attributed. I know there is a plan to have library focus groups that's coming for that in the future. So you all certainly have a large stake in this as well. So let's get some more input from the audience here. Let's hope this works. So here's a question for everyone here. Your library consortium is investing in open access. So we are interested in the usage of the open access articles and books we have funded. Do you agree or not, or either disagree or agree? And it should be open now for those who might have joined us a little bit later. You can go to slido.com and enter this number here, and we should see kind of a live action voting. And I can confirm there are a lot of votes. It's just, you all do happen to agree. Up to 31, 35, and growing. Aha. We get some more complexity coming up. Go ahead, and we have quite a lot of votes. Go ahead and close this for now. But you can see, at the very end, we have a disagree. But we have quite a lot of agreement that there is an interest in the usage of open access. So I'm going to stop the share here. And I'll ask our panelists about counter with open access usage metrics. What do you see as the role of usage statistics within the open access ecosystem? I'll start with Ivy.
Thanks, Anne. So I'll say that I used to think that it was not as important as I've come to believe usage data can be very valuable in open access. And the reason I say I used to think it was less important is thinking about the kind of hybrid open access usage that's creeping into our journal packages, and how that somehow is not, the institutional usage in the past was not able to be captured in the same way as closed access, and yet we were making decisions about packages based on the data that we had about closed access, despite the increased usage of hybrid access and also green open access. I think green open access is a real challenge for the way we use usage data. But I think when it comes to investing in open access resources, which is sort of a different problem space, I think usage data can be very, very valuable there, because we are also having to make decisions about what we invest in and why, and justifying those decisions for ourselves. And it's not always based on our own publishing activity. It may be based on much more global kinds of values, but also the value to the institution. So I think the work that Counter is doing to try and measure usage and develop standards for measuring open access usage, both globally, but also at the geolocation and institutional level, will be very valuable going forward as we invest more and more in open access resources, not specifically tied to our own publishing activity, but our usage and values of that content.
Shall I go next? I'd say we're very interested in the counter usage on open access material. And the more we've been thinking about it, the more we're thinking of kind of at the article level for institutions, because as we moved through like transitional agreements and towards a more pay to publish model, we want to be able to kind of monitor and evaluate that publishing aspect of the agreement, and being able to, I think, understand the usage of articles that your institution or your consortium has paid to publish is really important. And I think I'm quite interested as well in like Ivy says, also going beyond just perhaps the mere usage of the count if somebody's read it, but also to look at that broader kind of reach of the article, so that geolocation, but also whether or not the type of people or the type of organizations that are potentially using these articles. Are we moving, can we demonstrate impact beyond academia, and can we start to reach out to other areas of society. And I think being able to demonstrate that is, for any open access publication, like I say, is of value to both institutions and consortiums.
I agree that the article level usage is, as we move into transformative agreements or agreements that are focused on publishing activity, is super important. And I'm not sure that Counter is doing that specific work now, but that's something that I think is really worth discussing. How can we get article level data that we can use to evaluate the value of the publishing activity, and how we could justify that work, or not even just justify it, but represent the value of that to our constituency.
So one of the areas where we're starting to explore, I know you mentioned it, Ivy, was about the green usage. And we've been looking at perhaps trying to pull in some data from IRIS, so that the institutional repository usage stats, which I think is the counter as well. Somehow that with some green articles that we know might be deposited via the green route, and try to pull that together somehow. But as at very early days, I'd say.
And Joanna, I saw you unmute as well.
Yeah, I saw some comments in the chat about how usage isn't important in terms of the institutional level. It is much wider than that, and I just wanted to say that I absolutely agree, and we need to move, when we're talking open, we need to move away from focusing on what usage, internal usage, our investment in open, and when I say open, I don't necessarily just mean the transformative transitional deals. I mean open access books initiatives as well. What impact that is having on a much wider scale, not necessarily on that usage based in the institution. So I think it also needs a bit of a change of mindset from our point of view as librarians, but a really important one.
I think from the investment perspective, they're both kind of important. I agree that the global usage is much more interesting when it comes to just evaluating the impact of open access. But when one is making institutional choices about where and how to invest, I think as that becomes more of a norm, the ability to tie that investment back to what your own institution is actually using will have value. So I guess I'm a little bit conflicted about whether the institutional level usage is important for open access or not. I used to think it was not, but I'm beginning to think there's more value there in justifying one's own investment, right? Why would we invest in resource A and not in resource B? It's not necessarily because it's used, one is used more widely globally if we don't actually use it because we don't have programs, for example, in that discipline. So I think it's an interesting question, the role of institutional usage in open access. It's more about one's own investment than it is about evaluating the value of the resource itself.
I would just chime in and agree with that, Ivy. And I think at least here in my consortium, we're not a system of institutions. We are a nonprofit organization that is membership based. Libraries can come and go, and they have very different ideas about what investment in open access should look like at each institution. And so when you start taking that up at consortium scale and trying to argue for an investment in open access, it does matter at the institutional level to know what's happening and how we can present that case for, what is the best, how can we best invest our dollars collectively in order to serve the community that we work for. So I think I see both sides of that. I think, when I'm trying to make an argument about investment in open access, it's difficult to not have the institutional level knowledge of, how things are being used. And so I think it will continue to be important, at least at that scale, if we're going to make group investments where it's not a system decision. And that can be challenging.
Just to come back on that, I do agree it's useful at the local level, but it's more perhaps important at the local level that the research that's published at the local level is getting out there than necessarily the initiatives we invest in are being used locally. So I think it's just a shift in focus. But yeah,
I think certainly for our transformative agreements where we're investing in the publishing of our authors, we're much more interested in global usage in that context, right? it doesn't matter how our users are using our authors. It matters how our authors' work is having impact in the world. And that's actually the much more important value there.
No doubt. For Viva, we were talking with our state level folks, and it's interesting how open access is now much more broadly understood. And it's that faculty research and communicating the value of that to state funders and beyond that has been, I think it's just really opened up in the past year or so. A pandemic can do wonders for showing the value of open information. Let's see. Well, I think we have some, I call Amy in the chat for you to share more information if you have a link on your quadrant journal analysis. We love data visualization. It really takes it to the next level. But I think we do have one more audience question. Let me see if I can pull it up. And this was at slido.com. You can put in the code and then you can answer one more question. This is, it is, release 5 is continuous maintenance, which is very different than how Counter has done things in the past. This summer, there will be a few clarifications, and next year there'll be a lot of attention to open access and the larger update. But there is so much that Counter is, both to people in libraries and to people in publication, and also the folks that process and house that usage data for many publishers. There's a really broad ecosystem here. So it's kind of interesting to see from you all, what do you think Counter should prioritize? We have more effort to get greater compliance from publishers and vendors, more training and understanding usage data and using it to inform decision-making, or better metrics or open access content. Let's see how our poll is going. See some more coming in. Okay, we're going to call it. So we have as the top one here, more effort to get greater compliance for publishers and vendors, followed by training and understanding usage data and that informing decision making. And then at the bottom here, we have better metrics for open access content. So let's see, let's open it up here and I can go back to make sure the chat is there. Okay. So for our panelists, what do you think the future priorities of Counter should be? And what is the library's role in that kind of work? I'll start with Joanna.
Yes, can I say all three? That's cheating. No, I was just reflecting on how frustrating it is when publishers don't use Counter, because it just means that as librarians we're comparing apples and pears all the time, and it makes it really, really difficult to kind of make data-driven decisions. So I would just encourage Counter to keep on doing the good work it's doing to kind of recruit and engage with publishers. And I think particularly some of perhaps the newer publishers, some of the open access as publishers. And the other thing was around usage data, which I think we do need to be able to understand the data we're getting. And I think as libraries, we need to also be better at making sure that our staff have the skills that are required, not just to understand the data, but to be able to manipulate the data and to enable those decisions, because things are getting increasingly complex. And I'm just thinking about the work that we've done at the Royal Library recently in terms of our Elsevier negotiations and the kind of lift in skills that was required across the library to be able to complete that work.
Can I go next, Dan?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think all of those are important, but I want to add one that I think Counter's already doing it, and I'd like to, I hope to see it continue, which is to facilitate both tooling and collaborative work that happens inside of libraries and consortia to support the actual activity of gathering usage data and analysis of it, because I think having this standard is to rely on is so wonderful, and it's really on us as library staff and consortial staff to then go out and apply it and use it and put it in our license agreements that publishers need to provide this kind of data. And I think the more work that that Counter can do to help facilitate those kinds of conversations is really helpful. I think spreading the word out there that, you know, that libraries have a role in this too, and it's not all on Counter to do the work, but actually it's a collaborative effort, I think, between consortia and libraries, and making sure that we are doing our part to ensure that publishers are providing us data in a way that's meaningful to us. And I think Counter has done a fabulous job of collaborating with the CC Plus project and helping us design some tooling that would support that kind of activity. The more that we can use usage data, the more easily we can use it and consume it and understand it, the better it will be for all of us, regardless of sort of which of those priorities they fall into. So so I would just add that little plug that, you know, I think we all have sort of an advocacy kind of a role that we can play in collaboration with Counter, and I'd love to see Counter continue to facilitate, and you've done this before, and Lorraine's done a fabulous job of partnership, and I think just continuing on in that role is really critical.
Ivy?
I say well said. I'm not sure I can add anything to that. I mean, Counter has played such an important role in creating standards for usage data. That said, using usage data has still continued to be challenging because of the variability in vendor adoption, also because of changes in the standard over time, right? So trend data, we've always found extremely challenging, and I know Counter does provide some guidance around how to, for example, relate you know, the different releases of Counter, but some very specific support on how to do trend analysis with, you know, once a vendor moves from one version of the standard to another, that is going to affect all their customers globally in presumably a very similar way. And so having some tools around trend analysis could be useful, I think, for libraries. It's something that I know we've struggled with quite a bit. But just the work that Counter has done and moving into open access. Now we've just begun to put, of course, for many years, as probably most everyone has, we've had clauses in our licenses that require adherence to Counter, and we're starting to add open access usage tracking into those standards as well to signal to publishers that we do want usage tracking to also be applied to open access, and that will be important to us. So I think that's, you know, an aspect again of the partnership element, working together to try and advance standards activities. It's so valuable.
I don't think there's much more I can add, really, but I would just agree that, and also say I think that working towards compliance and consistency across all the different providers is so important. It's kind of that foundation for allowing us then use that usage data in combination with other data sets and to start doing, you know, insights from things. I mean, I remember in the library with the book usage statistics before release 5, and when you didn't have vendors and providers all subscribing to Counter usage for books, and it was fun, shall we say.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you all are talking about, and there are a number of comments in here, Anna talks about user privacy and Patty talking about non-compliance, a lot of it does get into contractual expectations, which is really important to facilitating Counter. I would also say that, you know, Patty, what do you include for non-compliance? It's really hard. You have to, ideally you'd have some sort of financial obligation change. I know that within Viva, we have started adding the optional consortium reports as required in contracts as much as we can. There's different pieces to it that I would say that publishers, I've seen an uptick in publishers, their standard licenses have more ownership of usage data. You have to strike the clauses that don't allow you to get access to your users' data or share it in the ways you'd want it to. So could you all speak a little bit about that sort of contractual relationship with publishers and the role that the code plays?
since I raised it, I'll say a few things about it, and also responding to the question. So the ability to share usage data for us is also important, and of course, many vendors for many years have tried to restrict one's ability to share usage data. So we negotiate against that when we can. Our model provision certainly would allow us to share usage data with other colleagues. By the same token, we want to restrict the ways in which vendors might be able to sort of remonetize that data or use it for other purposes for the data privacy reasons. So of course, personally identifiable information in general is something that we try and we have clauses around for user confidentiality or user privacy, but we try and restrict vendors reusing the usage data for other purposes as well. So, we have our interests, vendors have their own interests, and we negotiate over those things. I think the issue of compliance there is not so much one that we, if a vendor is not supporting, contracting is often really, it's about a dialogue. It's a document, but it's also an advocacy and education tool. So if a vendor is not supporting counter usage, we probably would take it out of the agreement, or we would recast the language as a goal to adopt that usage, right? Because we're trying to bring the vendor, bring the publisher along into a more standards compliance. So it's not necessarily about being punitive as it is about gaining adherence to standards. If there is a provision that does require it and the vendor isn't fulfilling it, then it becomes just any sort of normal breach issue. They have a contractual commitment that they're not complying with. But really, it's more about that discussion with the vendor, this sort of education and advocacy to help move all of us along in that space. And we'd be happy to share model license provisions. The LIBE license agreement has very good model provisions in that regard, which are, I think, the same as ours. So
I was just going to say, I'd echo what Ivy said, and we very much kind of work with the publishers and the suppliers to support them and to help them in adopting counter if they don't adopt, and try and provide that support where possible.
Well, I think we'll open up to, I'm going to look to the chat for questions. I see there's some really interesting points being made here, and one of them is coordinated with other standards such as KBART and usage and holdings. And I know for consortia that can feel particularly important as we try to carve out what is shared and paid for in a central way as opposed to what is subscribed to and paid for locally. Can you all speak to that kind of work that you've done to sort of map to entitlements and how that has worked or not worked? Or any future goals, such as maybe the CC+ area?
Well, maybe Amy can speak to it better than me, but we really haven't done it because it is so difficult to manage. And specifically within the CC+ project, one of the pieces of how it was sort of constructed was to enable support of consortial-wide usage statistics gathering at the individual institutional level that then could be viewed from a consortial perspective and lens, but also to allow individual institutions to add in other resources that they may have acquired outside of the consortium, because we recognize we're only one tiny percentage of what many of these institutions are actually using and acquiring for electronic resources. So that's one way of managing it, but we are certainly looking for the next phase of CC+ at ways of really helping to bring different data sources in and then sort of allowing CC+ data to then also export data to other systems. So if there are other softwares out there that would allow us to make some of those decisions more easily, we would really want to be able to take data that is counter data for certain resources and put it into other software that allows us to do better analysis.
I was just going to say, we kind of tried very much to do something along those lines, to map the kind of the usage to holdings. And to be honest, because we're such a large consortium, we were just overloaded with data. it was too much really for us to manage to achieve. But I think it would be very interesting to see if it was ever, achieved.
Yeah, I know in Vivo we spend in an inordinate amount of time mapping usage, but it's a never-ending challenge. There's no doubt for a whole variety of reasons, including changes and et cetera. We have a nice question here from James, which is, have you had success in publicly sharing completely openly any publisher's usage data reports? And I would just add as a tag on, what are the motivations for doing that, and what do you gain? What are the goals here? If anyone has done that or would think to do that.
I know in my previous consortium experience, we would publicly post our usage data reports, and we would just put that as part of our terms and our agreements that we were able to do that. And we did it as a matter of, in terms of goals, we did it as a matter of just making life relatively simpler for ourselves, because it is difficult to share out at scale usage data for hundreds of libraries at any single time, and to have that locked down didn't make a lot of sense, especially when state dollars were going into the acquisition of that content. And so in that situation, yeah, we opened up usage reports and made them widely accessible. And again, putting it in our agreements, that was just a requirement of the way that we did our work. And it's our data, and we felt like we needed to be able to share it that way.
And I see from Marie Kennedy, there is another example of aggregate usage data shared publicly. This kind of goes back early on. We had questions that were kind of on the theme of peer groups and metrics. I'll find this really quick. So have you found peer group institutions who share metrics and budget? So there also gets into questions of cost. And I know that is trying to set benchmarks, I might say, would be an aspect of that. Have your schools done work with trying to benchmarks against peer groups, and maybe to Joanna's earlier points, trying to find gaps in resources that should be more used, in at least a theoretical sense?
Well, I think a lot of times budget is one of those things that goes into determining who your peer group is too. That information is all publicly available for the most part, for most of our public institutions anyway, and our private nonprofit institutions. It's easy to find a library's materials budget data point in most cases. And at least in my experience, libraries naturally look for those they know are generally running along the same lines in terms of budget. So that study that I mentioned earlier, I did drop a link in the chat where you can see sort of one approach that we took in terms of trying to determine what peer groups matched there. But we were doing that for resources that the entire state received access to and didn't necessarily pay into out of a particular budget. It was just something that was a state resource. And then when individual institutions are paying a bill for resources, they're going to look for different peers that they know, whether that's somebody locally or across the country that's a competitor in some sense to those institutions. It's important to see that. And I think when you've got consortial relationships in place, you're maybe more likely to share more information with each other because there is a relationship there and able to share data. So I know some of my institutions do that. My hope with CC Plus is that we're going to actually be able to allow our institutions to more easily make that leap from, I know that that library over there is a peer institution for me based on similar budget structures and so on. And let's talk about what's happening and why it's different.
When one is talking with administrators, there's often the question of you present a number, and then the question is, well, what does that number mean? Is that a high number? Is that a low number? Is that an average number? Is that a good number? Without any comparative data, it's hard to represent that this something represents good value or average value or low value or high usage, et cetera. So I think part of the sharing value is to, you know, as Anne said, that benchmarking, right? To have something to measure against, whether to evaluate the numbers themselves are just numbers. They don't really tell a story.
I would say we at JISC, because we're working at that kind of consortium level, we don't necessarily benchmark within peer groups or groups of institutions, but we do look at that kind of almost benchmarking across our agreements. So we look at that value for money across all of our agreements and look at the average and where the different agreements sit to identify kind of real high value agreements and low value agreements for our members.
Just to come in from my experience from the UK, and I'm sure some UK colleagues, actually including Amy, can correct me, but I mean, we in the UK we use SCONL statistics a lot in terms of benchmarking and explain to our senior management why we need a particular budget, and also looking at that usage figure as well, which is also one of the, as I remember it anyway, one of the SCONL statistics that we share across UK HE libraries.
Well, we are basically at time. I want to thank our panelists so much for the lively conversation. That leads us to say that it's, of course, data is one piece, but it's the context, it's the story, as Ivy says, that you tell, the data that matters as well. Thank you all for being just great participants in the chat. We love getting your questions, and have a wonderful rest of your day. I know some are late in the day, some are early, from all over. So have a good day, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Anne.